Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of the Supreme Court chamber, bright lights reflecting off her bold red suit as she faced Chief Justice John Roberts directly. Her heart raced, but her eyes stayed steady. Moments earlier, Roberts had tried to silence her with a sharp, "Congresswoman, that's enough." His voice echoed off the marble walls like a warning shot. The sudden interruption sent a wave of whispers through the courtroom, tension filling every corner. Crockett gripped her notes tightly, but didn't flinch. Standing before 9 justices and hundreds watching, Roberts, with his lifetime appointment and nearly 2 decades leading the nation's highest court, was certain he could quiet this first-term representative from Texas. But Crockett, relying on her experience as a prosecutor and her firm belief in the Constitution, saw this as her moment to prove him wrong. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence clear and firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Chief Justice, the Constitution doesn't give you permission to silence an elected representative speaking about voting rights." The room fell silent. Roberts's expression froze, unprepared for such a direct challenge to his authority. This was no longer a procedural dispute, it was about the very principles of justice and representation. It was Crockett's chance to defend not just herself, but the democratic right to speak freely against what appeared to be judicial overreach. The chamber glowed under the solemn lighting. Chief Justice Roberts sat at the center of the bench, his black robe perfectly pressed, his gaze sharp with authority. The camera panned across the room as quiet whispers rippled through the gallery. The clerk's voice rang out, "The Honorable Court recognizes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Appearing as friend of the court, Roberts nodded slightly, offering a tight smile. "Representative Crockett from Texas's 30th District. You have 10 minutes. His tone carried the weight of his position, a conservative Chief Justice appointed by President Bush in 2005, known for his careful, measured approach and concern for the court's public image. Crockett walked to the podium with composed steps, her red suit vivid against the dark wood of the chamber. At 42, this freshman congresswoman from Dallas carried herself with the confidence of a seasoned civil rights attorney. Known for her direct, no-nonsense manner, she had quickly earned a reputation as a strong voice on constitutional issues, especially voting rights, the core issue before the court that day. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her deep voice resonating through the room. "I stand before you today not just as a congresswoman, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand how the erosion of voting rights has silenced communities across Texas and across this nation." She paused, meeting the eyes of each justice. "The case before you today isn't just about technicalities. It's about whether we still believe in the basic promise that all Americans deserve equal access to vote." Roberts shifted slightly, his expression unchanged but his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. The hearing on Williams v. Texas Election Commission had been expected to remain low-profile, focused on voter ID requirements. But Crockett's involvement had transformed it, drawing national attention in a packed courtroom. She stepped to the side, gesturing toward the Constitution displayed in the chamber. "When the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this very court in Shelby County, we were told other protections would remain. Yet here we are, 10 years later, facing the very voter suppression the VRA was meant to stop." The room tensed as Roberts leaned forward, his microphone catching a sharp breath at her pointed reference to one of his most controversial rulings. The stakes of the moment became clear. This was no longer about one case. It was a challenge to the entire Roberts Court's approach to voting rights. Justice Elena Kagan glanced toward Roberts, then back at Crockett, recognizing the tension rising. Justice Thomas sat motionless, while Justice Jackson leaned forward, fully engaged in what Crockett had to say. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of the Supreme Court chamber, bright lights catching the red of her suit as she faced Chief Justice John Roberts head-on. Her heart was racing, but her eyes stayed steady. Moments earlier, Roberts had tried to stop her with a sharp, "Congresswoman, that's enough." His voice echoed off the marble walls. Whispers rippled through the courtroom, tension filling the air. Crockett tightened her grip on her notes, but didn't flinch. Before 9 justices and a packed gallery, Roberts, confident after nearly 2 decades leading the court, expected to silence a first-term representative from Texas. But Crockett, armed with her experience as a prosecutor and her belief in the Constitution, saw this as her chance to prove him wrong. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the quiet. "With all due respect, Mr. Chief Justice, The Constitution doesn't give you permission to silence an elected representative speaking about voting rights." The chamber went still. Roberts' face froze, unprepared for the direct challenge. This was no longer a procedural matter. It was about principle and the limits of judicial power. Formal light filled the chamber. Roberts sat centered among the 9 justices, his robe immaculate, his gaze sharp. The clerk's voice carried, "The Honorable Court recognizes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, appearing as friend of the court." Roberts gave a brief nod. "Representative Crockett from Texas's 30th District. You have 10 minutes." His tone carried the full weight of authority, that of a conservative Chief Justice appointed in 2005. Crockett moved to the podium with composed steps, her red suit vivid against the dark wood. At 42, the freshman congresswoman from Dallas showed the confidence of a seasoned civil rights attorney. Known for her direct, no-nonsense style, she had become a strong voice on constitutional issues, especially voting rights, the focus of the day's case. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her low voice resonant. "I stand before you not only as a congresswoman but as someone who has seen how the destruction of voting rights has stripped communities across Texas and across this nation of their voices." She paused, meeting the eyes of each justice. "The case before you isn't about technical rules, it's about whether we still believe all Americans deserve equal access to the ballot." Roberts shifted slightly, eyes narrowing. Williams v. Texas Election Commission had been expected to stay low profile, a technical matter about voter ID laws. But Crockett's presence had drawn national attention and filled the courtroom. She moved aside, gesturing toward the Constitution displayed on the wall. "When the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this court in Shelby County, we were told protections would remain. Yet 10 years later, we see the very voter suppression the VRA was meant to prevent." The audience tensed as Roberts leaned forward, his microphone catching a sharp breath at her pointed reference to his own controversial decision. The confrontation's stakes became clear. It was now a test of the Roberts Court's entire record on voting rights. Justice Kagan glanced at Roberts, then back at Crockett, sensing the clash building. Justice Thomas sat unmoving. Justice Jackson leaned forward, fully engaged with Crockett's words. Eustace Jackson smiled slightly while Justice Alito frowned, creating a split-screen moment that would later go viral. Roberts tapped his microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett, this court decides cases based on constitutional principles, not policy preferences. Please continue with your legal argument." His tone was dismissive, almost condescending, a tactical mistake that would soon become clear. Crockett nodded, then turned to her strongest evidence. "Let me show you what constitutional principles look like in real life, Your Honor," she signaled to her aide, who distributed documents to the justices. "Before you are sworn statements from 70 Texas voters who were denied their right to vote despite multiple good faith efforts to comply with this law." She held up the first statement. Mary Wilson, 84 years old, born at home in East Texas in 1939, when birth certificates were rarely issued to black children in the Jim Crow South. She's voted in every election since 1965, but was turned away in 2022 because her baptismal certificate, the only record of her birth, listed a different middle initial than her Social Security card. Crockett moved to the next. James Fuentes, a disabled veteran who couldn't renew his license because the only DMV within 50 miles of his rural home isn't wheelchair accessible. They told him to drive to the next county. With each example, Crockett connected abstract legal principles to real human lives, making the constitutional violations impossible to dismiss as technicalities. The gallery was transfixed, and several journalists openly recorded her remarks. Roberts's patience began to thin. He glanced at the clock, then interrupted again. "Congresswoman, individual stories, while compelling, do not establish a constitutional pattern. We must focus on the legal standard, not emotional appeals." The dismissal of those experiences as emotional appeals gave Crockett the opening she'd been waiting for. She straightened, looked Roberts directly in the eye, and responded firmly. "Mr. Chief Justice, with all due respect, the Constitution wasn't written for abstract legal theories. It was written to protect real Americans like Miss Wilson and Mr. Fuentes. When the 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied or limited based on race, it doesn't include an exception for inconvenient facts or uncomfortable truths." The gallery erupted in whispers. Justice Jackson looked up sharply, while Justice Thomas leaned toward Justice Alito and murmured something. The confrontation had now moved beyond procedure into a debate over the meaning of constitutional interpretation itself. Roberts's face flushed slightly as he reached for his gavel. "Congresswoman, I remind you this is a legal proceeding, not a congressional hearing. Please maintain appropriate decorum." Instead of retreating, Crockett nodded and pressed forward. "Appropriate decorum, Your Honor, includes acknowledging the human cost of constitutional violations. I'm not here for theory. I'm here because real voters in my district are being systematically denied their most fundamental right." She turned to Justice Barrett. "Justice Barrett, in your confirmation hearing, you stated the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. Yet the law before you today has demonstrably prevented thousands of eligible voters from exercising that right. How can that possibly survive constitutional review?" Roberts immediately cut in, his voice sharp. "Congresswoman Crockett, address your argument to the court as a whole, not individual justices, and refrain from questioning the bench directly." The tension in the room reached its peak. Roberts was clearly frustrated, having failed to rein her in. The separation of powers was playing out in real time, a Chief Justice attempting to assert authority over a member of Congress who refused to be silenced. Crockett nodded but stayed composed. "I apologize for the direct question, Mr. Chief Justice. Let me rephrase for the court. How can any law that demonstrably prevents thousands of eligible voters from casting their ballots possibly withstand review under the 14th and 15th Amendments?" Roberts leaned forward, his patience nearly gone. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have repeatedly disregarded this court's guidance. If you cannot follow procedure, your time will be cut short." The threat hung heavy in the air, a Chief Justice attempting to silence an elected representative during a hearing about voting rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the gallery, where several civil rights leaders sat watching. Cameras captured every second, including the uneasy faces of justices shifting in their seats.